Welcome back to our second class, Devin. I'm glad you're back. You didn't bail
glad
after
I'm
the
back
first
too.
one.
Yeah.
This is
I
awesome.
did it. Yeah.
Hoping you think this is a dumb idea.
No, I'm great with this. I've loved it. I think we got a lot of good response from the first video. So I'm just overall really excited about the series.
I am too, man. I am. I'm glad you're with me for this. And Devin always brings great insight. He's a brainy kind of guy. But we're asking this big question: how should we then live? And I think that's an important question to ask today.
Definitely.
How should we live our lives amidst confusion, uncertainty, and the world around us? It seems like the foundations are shaking more and more all the time. And we're going to ask a weird question today. This may sound strange. This almost gets into thinking about how you think.
Yeah, which is confusing.
Yeah, chase that around for a while.
But it's a good thought to have. Yeah.
It is. Why do we think the way we do? And so the question we're asking, the big question today, is how do you truly know things? You know, how do you truly know something for sure? How can you latch onto something with certainty and go, okay, I believe this, and I can base my life on these beliefs or these assumptions? Now, last week we talked about this idea of what is truth. We talked about the fact-value dichotomy, that one reason the world's so messed up is we have split our worlds into two separate watertight categories. We've said, okay, we have your values, which are the upper story, and that's for church and religious experience. Then the lower story is the facts and information that science and empirical evidence gives us, and that's more valid. You know, that's going to control the public sphere and arena. And it's okay to go to church and have your religious experience on Sunday, but please don't bring those values, which are not based on empirical evidence, into the real world. And so today we're going to ask some big questions. We're going to look at this idea of evidence, specifically empirical evidence. And I think Devin and I want to make it clear that we don't have a problem with evidence.
Nope. I'm a big proponent. Well, and the big thing that I think is important to bring in when you talk about, you know, a lot of Christians will dive into empirical evidence. We don't need any of that. Well, that's not true. Empirical evidence is really good.
Yeah.
My faith is not simply intellectual assent. My faith, my Christian faith, is grounded in the resurrection, which is a very empirical, evidential type something to bring up, you know?
Yeah, the tomb was empty.
Right.
It doesn't get more
Sought.
evidential than that.
Yeah.
But, you know, what we're talking about today is this idea of empirical evidence. Like, you have to go into a laboratory, so to speak, and prove something through an experiment of some kind. And if it's not proven by science, then it's not a valid or rational belief. And some people have taken it really far. Like, I've got a quote from W.K. Clifford, and Clifford said this: "It is wrong everywhere, always, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence."
Yeah.
It's almost like the opposite of the Vincentian canon. If you go back in church history, there's this thing called the Canon of St. Vincent, which he said Christianity is what's been believed by all people in all places at all times. It's almost like he's taking off on that, but doing a riff. But it's wrong if you don't have evidence to believe in something. And on face value, I go, well, I agree with that. You need to have evidence for what you believe in. But I want to give you this proposal for this class. And this is the evidentialists, and I'm talking about empirical evidentialists. Their approach to knowledge and information, they would say something like this: a person's belief is rationally justified only if she or he has good evidence for that belief. So I want us to think about this for just a second today. You know, if I've got a preacher in, you know, backwoods Alabama, I don't know why it's got to be backwoods, Devin, but it's backwoods Alabama. I actually grew up in backwoods Alabama, so that's a good thing. And you've got this scientist who's an atheist, let's say Richard Dawkins. Do both of those fellows base every bit of their rational belief on empirical evidence? And I think if you think that through for just a minute, does even Richard Dawkins, who is an ardent atheist, almost a militant atheist, would all of his beliefs be based on empirical evidence? Something to think about.
Yeah.
So what are some accusations, Devin, that atheists make against Christians when it comes to this idea of evidence?
Maybe a good way to put it is not even necessarily a three-step, but looking at it this way is, I think a lot of people, and this is, you know, I can't speak for all atheists. I cannot speak for all people who do not believe in a higher power, who are not theistic in any way. But for the most part, in my conversations, personal communications I've had with people who do not believe, this is normally how the argument flows, is that Christians do not have good evidence for belief in God. In that a person's belief is is rationally justified, almost exclusively rationally justified only if he or she has good evidence for that belief. And since therefore Christianity, the Christian is not rationally justified in believing in God. I don't know if that made any sense at all, because I feel like I messed it up a little bit. But how that goes is someone would say, as a Christian, you do not have good evidence for what you believe in. And since a person's belief is only rationally justified, if she has good evidence, he has good evidence for that belief. Therefore, that person doesn't have a good justification for what they believe in. And I think that kind of comes down to, a lot of times, what we would say is good evidence. Maybe not all the time, but that's kind of the differentiation we kind of talked about at the beginning. What classifies itself as good evidence? Is it simply something that I can touch, see, smell, work out over and over again in a laboratory type facility or situation? Or is there another type of good evidence? Are there several other types of good evidence that I can just as well lean on or appeal to when making justifications for the things that I believe in? Does that kind of make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. And what I'm hearing you say, which I think it really is important for people listening to this class, is you'll have atheists come to us and say, okay, rational belief. Is it rational to believe in Christianity? If you don't have this empirical evidence, then it's irrational.
Right.
You're an irrational person. And I think we would push back kindly in a Christian way and say, we do believe that faith in Christ is rational. I'm a rational person. You're a rational person. We're educated people. And we believe it's very rational. Or I wouldn't believe it. Mm-hmm. I believe Christianity is true because it makes sense of reality. It is true. I don't believe it because it's a crutch or it's going to help me get through life. I believe it's true. And we're going to make a few proposals in this class. First of all, we don't have a problem with evidence. We want to get that out of the way. We're not irrational people. Let's say if Devin and I were charged with a crime, we would want the police to collect good evidence.
Yes.
I would want them to do a really good job. I would not want bribes to be taken. I would not want corruption. I would want them to do a great job and collect good evidence. So we have no problem with evidence. But here's where the rub comes. Empirical evidence is not the only way to have rational beliefs. Mm-hmm. You can have rational beliefs that are not based on empirical evidence. We're going to make a case for that, actually. Mm-hmm. So we want you to hold on for that and really think that through. What I just said is very important. That empirical evidence is not the only way to have rational belief. There are other ways to have rational beliefs. Evidentialism is not self-validating. Devin's going to talk about that in just a minute, so I don't want to steal his thunder. He's going to come and bring some good stuff. Evidentialism, this idea that you got to have empirical evidence to have rational belief, there are some weaknesses to that claim for it being the encompassing, the only way that we get rational beliefs. Some rational beliefs are accepted without empirical evidence. We have some things that we believe, that you believe, that Devin believes, that I believe, that are not based on empirical evidence from a laboratory setting or from science. We believe them and we can put great stock in those. Typically, our foundational beliefs, and here's the cool part for us as Christians. Foundational beliefs that all people have, whether you're an atheist, a Christian, Hindu, Muslim, it doesn't matter. Foundational beliefs a lot of times are ones that you accept without empirical evidence. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of foundational beliefs that we just have. And then testimony is important. I accept a lot of things just based on testimony. That's just the way it is. I take, you tell me something sometimes, Devin, maybe you share a piece of news from the latest news cycle. Well, I'm going to believe you because I know who you are and you're a trustworthy source. So a lot of times I take some things just on testimony from other people. So I want you to just think about this for just a minute and let's just mull this over. This is going to be a class where we have to think through some of these issues. And I will say this idea of evidence, and Devin's going to get to this, but I'm going to ask this question, and Devin's going to take this up. Where is the evidence that evidentialism is the only way for rational belief?
And that's where we come into the big problem. That's where we hit kind of the rubber hits the road, because then you've really got to account for it. This is a really tough thing for even me to talk about because we're talking about the way that we know something, the way that we are subconsciously taking in information and applying it to life, things normal people, honestly, don't usually think about. But God has given us the ability to understand, to a limited degree, understand how our minds are working and understand how we take in statements and truth statements and how we apply those to our lives. So there's a couple of issues we come to when we start talking about this idea that empirical evidence is the only way that I can know something. For one, for starters, it is not self-validating. And what I mean by that is in the simple phrase, I think Chris has already said it. If not, we had just said it before we got started here, was if I'm going to say that evidentialism, that is, this belief that empirical evidence is the only thing that can prove things to me, what is the empirical evidence? Stay with me. What is the empirical evidence that empirical evidence is the only way that I can know something?
That's a revolutionary question.
I know, and it's so, because I feel confusing saying it, and I hate that, because I hate thinking that someone's not understanding what I'm saying.
But that's really it. What you just said is very profound. It really is.
And I'm not the only person to say it, or the first person to say it by any means, but that's what it comes down to. If I'm going to say, the only way that I can know something is if I touch and see it, smell it, taste it. Well, who says, what has been proved, what laboratory experiment went on that said the only way you can know something is by seeing, touching, tasting it, or it being in a laboratory experiment? It hasn't, but I think we've been so ingrained the past 100, 150 years that is the way that we come to know things. We've taken which pill is it? The blue or the red one?
I think it's the red pill.
The
is
red
that the
pill?
Matrix reference?
The Matrix, whichever pill that keeps us in the Matrix.
Morpheus. Morpheus gives you the red.
Yeah,
pill.
we're willing to just accept what's going on around us. But when we start thinking about, okay, why do I think I know this? How do I know this? That's when you take the other pill finally, and you're saying, okay, why am I saying that this is the only way I can know something? So it's not self-validating. I think also if it's not an infinite regress type of answer, it's at least a regress to where we fall into different avenues of appealing to knowledge or ways of knowing things. And what I mean by that is if I was to say, well, I know this because I can see it or taste it or touch it, and someone says, well, how did you come to think that that was the right way to do it? Well, I've got then to appeal to some other reason. But I think this is where it normally brings us maybe a down to earth type of example, as if I say, if I was talking to a professor and I asked the professor, well, how did you know this piece of information that you have just shared with me? And he says, well, I know it from this certain experiment. Let's say it's a science professor. He says, from this certain experiment. And I say, well, since you weren't the one to actually perform the experiment, are you not taking the testimony of someone else? And so it's not an empirical, evidential way of coming to know something. It was actually through testimony. And I think you're going to expound on that a little bit more in a second. And then we maybe even have this third way of looking at it, in that it is, if not circular reasoning, we're back to the it's not self-validating, but the circular reasoning of me saying something like, if you asked why I believe in something and I say, well, because I saw it, tasted it, touched it, etc. And you said, well, how do you know that that's the right way to come to information? And I simply say, because I saw it, tasted it. There's no reasoning behind that. It's just, does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like you're chasing your tail.
Yeah, I'm just chasing my tail and trying to find an answer that's not there.
Right.
That's not there in this realm of empirical evidence.
Yeah, and I hope people understand why this is so important. They're probably thinking, why are you having a class?
And why am I getting so worked up about it?
Yeah, why are we so excited about it? So tore up. But we are living in a time where we are told that religious values, like, okay, I rationally believe the tomb was empty and it informs my life. I base my life on that. So I have what I believe to be a rational belief in Christianity, and it's true. But we're told that's discounted, that really in the public realm what matters is this empirical evidence, that And our priests of the day, so to speak, are scientists in their lab coats. When they say something with their lab coats on, well, that's a different level of truth. That's a different level of information. So what we're trying to do is help you see through that is kind of bunk, to be honest. There's major flaws with that. And really to our detriment in the 21st century and post-modernity, it's really hurting us right now, because in this time, we need rationality. We need to think through difficult issues, and we need objective truth. And let me just share with you some things that I take based on testimony. I believe that I'm the child of my parents. And I believe that early on because they told me. Now, I could have empirical evidence. I could go get a DNA test and prove it, but I just agreed with them that, okay, I took that on faith. Call it faith if you want to, faith to the rescue. I believe that we live in a heliocentric solar system. Now, if I were to really look at that based on evidence, I would go, well, it really doesn't appear to be that way. It appears like the Earth is the center, but I take it based on testimony of reputable people that I believe that we are in a heliocentric universe. Now, that's rational, but I don't have a test tube empirical experiment where I actually did that, but I took that based on testimony of others. I believe China is a real country across the globe. I always thought the little silly dig a hole to China stupidity we talked about as children. But, I've not been to China. Some of you might have been to China. But even if you went to China, would you really know you're in China? I mean, it could be people just putting on a big ruse. I mean, maybe if they pull the screens down on the plane's windows and you couldn't look outside, maybe you never crossed the ocean. Maybe they went out in the ocean, you went back and you're someplace in America where there's this huge giant Hollywood set and they make you think it's like the Truman Show.
Truman Show, yeah.
You're really in seaside Florida, you're not in China. But there's a lot of things we take on testimony. There's things that we assume. And here's where I want to get to. I'm going to close in a minute with this thought that I think is really important. There are certain base assumptions that atheists and Christians come to the table with. And these are these foundational assumptions. And atheists, and like Devin, I don't want to speak for all atheists. I don't like when Christians are caricatured and lumped together. I don't like that at all, and I don't want to do that to atheists. I don't want to be uncharitable. But I will say this, most atheists come to the table with an assumption there is no God. There's no test tube experiment for that. You can't really disprove God's existence using empirical evidence. You can't. That's a metaphysical, deep concept you came to based on assumptions. Likewise, as a Christian, I come to the table with deep metaphysical assumptions. There is a God, and that makes sense of reality. So I'll launch into that a little bit later as we kind of close up our arguments. But I want to get you there. That's what we're driving to. These baseline assumptions are rational, we would say. An atheist would say his atheism is rational, just like I would say my theism is rational. But those are not based on empirical evidence. They're based on other types of evidence. They're based on other types of rationality, but they're still rational and they're still valid, just as valid as empirical evidence. So, Devin, there's this argument out there that maybe some of our listeners and watchers have not heard before, that atheism is not the default position for human beings. That actually theism is the default position for people. That we are born believing in some type of higher power. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, and it comes in several forms. I think one of them is where, and maybe this is I don't want to speak again for the new atheist group, but it's the only group of people that I've heard the argument come from is, well, I'm only a Christian because I was born here. I was born in America. I was born in the South, and that's why I'm a Christian. That's why I hold all these beliefs. If you'd been born somewhere else, you'd have believed in a different God. If we would just have not been born in a country who had, earlier beliefs in a God, then we wouldn't believe in a God. And I don't think that's entirely true. It was a couple of years ago, Oxford had released a study that they did. It included 57 researchers over 20 different countries. It was a 3-year study they conducted. And what they came to is that we all have this fundamental kind of natural position of believing in a God, of being theistic, not necessarily monotheistic, where we believe in one God, but we at least, the people that they conducted the study through or with, believed in a higher power, someone who at least was an intelligent mind and created things, at least that much. whether that's polytheism, monotheism, whatever it be. That's pretty much the majority of the world. That seems to be our natural disposition. And that's something that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. I'm going to read that. For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Since what can be known about God is evident among them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became nonsense, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. So it's this argument from Paul saying, and it's almost this, other letters from Paul, we're going to get this testimony as to the empirical evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But here we have this testimony from Paul as well that God has given us all the evidence that we need. So someone who claims to not have a natural inclination towards belief and obedience to a God probably needs to do a little bit of reevaluation. Even if it's not, I'll go so far as to even say, even if it's not someone who claims to be a theist, they would, maybe they're saying, oh, I have no inclination towards a higher power, towards a God. If you believe in science, I think you do, though. Specifically, even if you're an evolutionist, because you believe in natural selection. Natural selection being the mind behind everything else that's selecting one thing over another. That's a belief in a higher power, a belief in yourself, where you are an individualism, where your main priority is to serve and to love yourself. That's the form of a God. That is the form of putting something, a higher power, above you. And that's a little bit off topic, but if you find yourself saying, I have no natural inclination towards a higher power, I think you need to do some reevaluation.
I would agree. Definitely. There's this, we're craving some type of overarching story that makes sense of it all. That's what we want. Like the theory of everything. People are craving it, the theory of everything. I want to just close us out with this thought as we think about what we've learned so far and what we've explored, thinking about how we think. Imagine there's a house, and I'm going to put a graphic up for you, and you've got this foundation, and of course the house is built upon that foundation. That foundation would be your assumptions, those bedrock assumptions. Okay, let me give you a few assumptions I have. I believe that my senses are reliable, that what I'm seeing, what I'm smelling and tasting and everything about the world is reliable. I believe that. I don't think that I'm a brain in a vat in a laboratory dreaming all this. I think I'm a real human being in a real space and time here in Dothan, Alabama, alive right now in this moment. I believe that. So I assume that, and I think I'm okay to assume that. So there are certain assumptions we all have. Some make assumptions that there is no God. And so everything about reality is based on that idea that there is no God. And so they're going to try to make sense of all reality based on that assumption. Now, that's not coming, like I said earlier, from empirical evidence. And I would say there is a God. And we have a creator God that cares about us. And, I think that's rational. So everything is interpreted in light of those two assumptions. The rest of the house, so to speak, the rest of the house of your thought world. So here's where assumptions really matter. Let's say you're an archaeologist out in the southwestern desert of the United States. And let's just say there's a belief that there have been no civilizations in the southwestern desert of the United States at all. No civilizations have been there at all. So if I'm out there and I notice there's some pottery there on the ground, and there's this bowl, it's obviously a bowl that's made of some type of rock. If I believe no civilization has been there, I'm going to have to think, well, there has to be a natural explanation for this. The wind and the weather and the water and time has crafted this thing. It looks like a bowl, but it can't be, right? There's been no civilization there. If I'm an archaeologist that believes that the Pueblo civilization had been there, I would go, well, look what the Pueblo people made. This is a natural, rational explanation. They made this bowl. It has evidence of design. So your baseline assumptions matter. So I had students one time ask me, I was teaching chemistry at a high school. We had another teacher. I don't want to tell you too much information because I don't want to offend anyone. But there was another teacher there, and that teacher was highly educated. Went to some very reputable schools, and that teacher did not believe in God, was an atheist. And so my students came to me and said, why is Mr. So-and-so an atheist? He's so brilliant. He's so smart. And then could we be wrong? I mean, he really is smart, and he says there is no God, so should we just take stock in that? And I said, well, yeah, he's brilliant, actually. He's smarter than I am. But he has a really bad first assumption. You can have brilliant people that have a bad first assumption. You know, I would say Richard Dawkins is brilliant. I would say Sam Harris is brilliant. I would say they speak on certain subjects, and I think, okay, they are spot on. Christopher Hitchens, who's passed on now, was a brilliant man. I enjoyed listening to these people. I don't throw away everything they say because they're atheists. That would be stupid and silly because all truth is God's truth. But they had a really bad first assumption. Mm-hmm. Now, they would say it's rational, and I would say, okay, well, you can say that's rational. I believe my belief in Christ is rational. But that bad first assumption is they said, all there is this physical universe, and that's it. So I have to come up with an explanation from the physical universe to describe how the universe got here in the first place. So I've got to come up with this naturalistic mechanism of the Big Bang and then chance mutations. Well, first of all, you had to have just the right kind of heavy elements there in the Big Bang experience, and you had to have them coalesce into planets, and then one planet had to be just right in its distance from its medium-sized star, and then, you know, then you had to have the prebiotic soup that was just right, maybe a lightning strike or something that got these things going, and then lo and behold, by just all these chance events, you get highly evolved life on Earth. Well, that seems to me irrational in a lot of ways. There's a lot of leaps of faith there, but they have to have that belief because they start with a bad first assumption, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So all we're trying to propose to you today in this class is it is perfectly rational to believe things that are not based on empirical evidence. Mm-hmm. And we believe Christianity makes the best sense of reality as it is. Not just empirical evidence, but just reality, living life and experience, that it makes the most sense of evidence, so to speak. And one last thing, I don't want to make this the class that ate the United States, but one last thing that I think, like these epiphanies that come to us sometimes, when we demand empirical evidence for God, we're making a fundamental mistake. And here's the mistake. A lot of times people will say, well, you know, there's Bigfoot, there's Yeti, there's the Loch Ness Monster. You know, where's your evidence for Yeti, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster? We want pictures. We want like a hide left over, a skin or a skeleton, right? Well, it's perfectly okay to demand that because those are entities within this physical world. They are part of the creation. So we should find evidence of them here on earth. God is a spiritual being who is transcendent. Now, we can read evidence of him in the created order, but you're not going to find God like encapsulated in a fossil somewhere, so to speak. So sometimes people are making a fundamental mistake. Well, Devin, we've said a lot today, a whole lot, and I hope we've helped people think about how they think a little bit.
Me too.
And think about evidence.
Yeah, and it's important, it's critical, and again, I hope you've heard everything we said, and it's going to push you to look into it a little bit more and think about the way you think things and the way you take in knowledge.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Of course.
And we thank you for watching these classes. It encourages, like you have no idea. I'm not saying we're fragile, but if we don't get
That's what I was about to say.
so many views, I mean, we're going to get like crushed and get in a corner and eat chocolate and cry and watch soap operas. But it does encourage us, though, when we have people that give us feedback. And we like challenge, too. I mean, iron sharpens iron, so maybe we said something that we could have phrased better. I mean, the human language, I mean, you always do not say enough a lot of times. So maybe we need to clarify a point. We need to know that. We need to know where we need to be sharper with our argument. But with all that said, thank you, Devin. Thank you for watching this video, and we'll be back next week. We're going to talk about the Imago Dei, the image of God.
There we go. See you next time.
God bless.